Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm James Woolcock. Lizzy, since we were last on together, how many Conservative policies have you seen announced in the election campaign?
I'm losing track already.
I'm trying to think. So there's National Service over the weekend, and then there's also now, as of this morning, they're not slowing down, with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak set to announce what he's calling Triple Lock Plus on pensions, which we'll be getting into in a bit. It's sort of the latest twists and turns on the campaign.
And over in Labourland, they're touting the endorsement of 120 past and present business leaders getting behind Labour's economic plans. And the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves says it's a sign Labour is the new party of business.
Today, I want to put forward a simple proposition, that this changed Labour Party is today the natural party of British business. And I want to set out the central economic fault line in this election, the choice before the British people on the 4th of July. 5 more years of chaos with the Conservative Party leaving working people worse off, or stability with a changed Labour Party.
See that dividing line there? Because now you've got Prime Minister Rishi Sunak later today going to be announcing, as we said, this pension pledge. In his view, the economy has turned a corner.
Inflation down, back to normal at 2%. Energy bills falling, the economy growing faster than Germany, France, America. Wages have been rising faster than prices for 10 months now. The plan is working.
I think there's, with all this kind of slew of election appearances, the one thing to try and remember and keep in mind when we're hearing all these voices is, what are they trying to signal? And I mean, with Rishi, it is pensions are safe with the Conservatives, and with the implication that Labour can't be trusted. And with all these Reeves announcements, it's the idea that the Labour Party has changed and can now be trusted with the economy. Fundamentally, it's the same dividing line they're signalling, just with completely opposite opinions.
We also managed to speak to the man who's vying to be the next business secretary, who will be, if the polls are right. That's Labour's Jonathan Reynolds. Take a listen.
At the heart of Labour's plans is a belief that the economy can grow more strongly. I think we've got very strong reasons to say why that is the case. And the reason people are paying in the UK a historically high tax burden for quite poor public services is that lack of growth. And so if you look at the specifics of what Labour has put forward, look at our plans, for instance, on a better relationship with the European Union, mutual recognition, professional qualifications, labour mobility. These are practical things that will improve the competitiveness and investability of the UK and make growth perform more strongly.
So that's Labour's pitch, and we can hear more about that in a moment. But I just want to get back to this pensions policy. We heard Rishi Sunak pitching himself on the steps of Downing Street, as he called the election, as the man who rescued the UK economy. Now you've got Labour also keen to fight the 2024 election as the economic election. And James, I think it's interesting that day by day, Rishi Sunak confirms a strategy that our political editor Alex Wickham reported last week that he would employ. First, to fend off the threat from Reform, this right-wing party started by Nigel Farage, the Brexit campaigner. And because he's pursuing Reform, he's doggedly pursuing the votes of older Britons, which he clearly thinks Reform might steal, before he focuses on the threat from Labour. And Alex managed to get his hands on this internal document that was produced by senior party officials over the weekend. It warns that more than 100 Tory MPs risk losing their seats if voters who previously backed the Tories either back Reform or choose not to vote on July the 4th. Now, it's important because it's the first time that Sunak's aides have put a number on the threat posed by Reform. But this is perhaps why you've seen a snap election to try and get in before Reform gets its act together, a proposal to bring back national service, Dad's Army, as Keir Starmer called it, hardly one for the Gen Z vote, and now today the expected announcement of a tax cut for pensioners. Now my question is whether this is really a tax cut, so we've got a man in who's across all that fiscal detail.
Indeed. I mean, joining us now is Bloomberg's senior economics reporter, Phil Aldrick. Now, Phil, look, we've been talking about this pensioners' tax cut is what the Conservatives are calling it. I'm not sure if you'll quite use those terms. I think, given what we've had in terms of the triple lock, you know, the idea that state pension rises by the highest of earnings, inflation, or 2.5%, why is Rishi Sunak choosing to put money here? And can you set out for us quite how much money this is going to cost?
So the IFS have done a little bit of calculation here, and there's an estimate that it'll cost about 1.2 billion. I think they don't specify exactly the amounts, but there's been about 2.4 billion pounds worth of tax raised by not increasing the threshold for pensioners since the threshold was first frozen. It's over £1 billion, and there's been no explanation of where that money's going to come from. But the idea here, is, as Lizzy set out, is basically to get out the vote. The Tories need their electorate to actually show up, because they're obviously worried that's not going to happen. And Labour are obviously saying that this is not a policy they would follow. Is it a tax cut? It is, if you take the status quo, but obviously, again, the IFS has pointed out that the status quo has been set by this government. So this government raises the taxes, and then this government gives a cut later on, just before an election, in a manifesto. Potentially it's going to be in a manifesto. So it's a cut relative to their own tax rises.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very delicate dance that's going to go on for both the parties throughout this campaign, isn't it, about what's a tax cut and what's a tax rise. We've been hearing from the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves on the airwaves over the weekend. She said clearly she wouldn't raise income tax or national insurance, but then not wanting to go into detail on public spending cuts that she would make. Do you think that we're going to hear more on those public spending cuts, or do you think that she might actually raise the other main lever of tax, which is VAT?
Is possible. I find it very unlikely. I think VAT is seen as a slightly regressive tax. It does raise the prices for everyone indiscriminately, of whether you're poor or well off. I mean, the idea about this being a tax cut, obviously the Tories can pitch it as a tax cut if you take the relative position of what Labour would do, which at the moment is stated that they would not do this pensioner sort of giveaway. So the Tories can claim that you get lower taxes under the Tories than you would under Labour. I mean, what's going to happen on the public spending stuff? I'm guessing it's going to be a no-go area on the election, because Labour can't pledge to increase spending massively without having to explain where the money's coming from. But the Tories have set these spending programmes, and they say they can deliver them through productivity, which everybody questions whether that's really feasible. So neither party is going to want to touch what is effectively an unexploded bomb after the election, with the how do you deal with the fact that public services will only continue to struggle.
But it's fascinating you raised that point, Phil, because I know we're only at barely a week into the election campaign, although it feels like a lot longer already. You can kind of see the momentum in the polls with Labour being 20 points ahead, with how the Conservatives are bringing out all these policies, as you said, to try and reach older voters and bring them back away from voting reform. The attack line, going back decades now, has always been that Labour can't be trusted on the economy. But now it is, at least so far in the campaign, the Conservatives are pulling out all the sort of the very high-octane, high-value, expensive policies. Look at national service, where the money's coming from the levelling up policies, and look at the spending on defence as well. Does there come a point where, think tanks, others, academics start pointing to the Conservatives and going, actually, you're the ones who are fiscally irresponsible if you were to win the election here?
People are already saying that. I mean, the point that's been made for quite a long time now is that the way that the tax cuts are being financed, which is through these unspecified spending cuts on public services, it's been called a fiscal fiction by the head of the OBR. It's been similarly called fictional by a number of economists. The IFS has been constantly critical of this. It does damage the Tories' usual attack line that Labour cannot be trusted with the public finances. Both parties have got a degree of uncosted promises. So it's I'll punch you, you punch me back, and we're back to square one. Again, I think this is a territory where they'll probably avoid going into these public spending promises, because after the election, as happened actually in 2015, after George Osborne had a budget in early 2015, he won the election. It was a bit of a surprise because they thought there was going to be a coalition again. And then they came up with another budget literally 2 months later, and it was a very different outlook. So you'd imagine this is exactly what will happen. We're going to get a very different outlook at the budget, which will come in about 2 months after the election this time.
It's kind of ironic that they want both parties for this to be the economic election when they're so fiscally constrained that there's barely anything that they can actually do boldly in terms of fiscal policy, and then both of them agreeing that they want growth, and yet the IFS saying you can't cross your fingers and hope growth's going to come and spare you tough choices. Why are they both focused on the economy?
I suppose that Labour have to seize this and say we are credible. We're going to be proper stewards, safe stewards of the economy, and they need to get that set in. So this letter from the business leaders today, that helps with that. The Tories can say we actually did have a pretty horrific few years. I mean, not everyone deals with COVID and the war in Ukraine and massive energy price spike, inflation to the highest it's been since the 1980s. This was a series of supply shocks which was very similar to what happened in the 70s. So this was a bit of a surprise, and the Tories have got inflation down. The economy is recovering. Unemployment hasn't shot up. So you can say that they've stewarded that part of the economy quite well. But it does feel a little bit like the Tories are going to try and shift the agenda a little bit onto defence. And I mean, we've got the national service stuff and there's the defence spending cuts. But I think the idea of national security, and saying that Keir Starmer used to be an ally of Jeremy Corbyn, who wanted to basically get rid of the army and to scrap the Trident nuclear deterrent, etc. I mean, I feel that will be another territory where the Tories can try to make gains. The economy will always be one of the sort of bedrocks of any campaign.
Is the economy stupid?
Well, there you go. Phil, our senior UK economics reporter, thank you very much for joining us. I mean, Lizzy, it is fascinating that I think Labour at the moment are getting the benefit of being so far ahead. You're seeing it with these endorsements. But come an election win, Rachel Reeves was ruled out a summer budget in her Q&A after the speech today. But they do have a lot of questions yet to answer on the green transition, on what they want to do on workers' rights. It's not all over, I don't think, just yet.
I wonder whether that's because after 14 years out of office, they need to dig into the numbers and see what they can afford. We'll talk about that more on coming shows. But that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.